Well, the tablet of visitation and that beautiful song will help to focus our minds on the subject of this evening's talk, which is the life and work of Abdu'l Bahá, which will be given by Mrs. Betty Reid. And she'll be talking on this subject every evening for the rest of the week. So it's a wonderful opportunity for us all to really study his life and feel closer to him, which I'm sure will happen tonight. Now, Betty Reid is known to you all, I'm sure, but it does no harm to remind you of her service in the faith. She's been a Baha'i for almost 45 years now. She served on the National Assembly of Great Britain for 17 years, and for the last 9 of those, she was its secretary. In 1953, the Universal House of Justice appointed her as a councillor for Europe. So she left her work in industry, where she had worked for 20 years, and devoted her life to being a councillor for 15 years. And for every 9 months of those years, she travelled throughout Europe from Iceland right to Cyprus. In 1957, she made her pilgrimage, where she was in the presence of the beloved guardian. And when her term as councillor came to an end, she decided she would like to settle in Northern Ireland, much to the delight of the Northern Irish Baha'i community, and she is now a member of Castlereagh community, which is just on the outskirts of Belfast. But she doesn't sit still for very long. She still travels all over the place, and I know she's just been to Germany recently. And at present she's involved in working on a project with the Ministry of Education in Estonia, and she is a representative of the National Assembly of Finland and is working on a foundation course for peace studies. So she has done wonderful service to the faith, and we all have a lot to learn from her experience. So please welcome Mrs. Betty Reid.
Dearest friends, I do bring to you all the warmest love of the friends in Switzerland and Germany and Finland and Estonia. And I think one of the most wonderful things about being a Baha'i is that we really have the possibility to get to know the world. And not only the Baha'is, but the people all over who live in it. And I think there are 2 ways of getting to know it all. One way is that you get up for different reasons and you travel. And the other way is that you stay at home and all the travelers pass you by. So whatever happens, sooner or later, you meet everybody. Wonderful things. When more than 100 friends from Spain came for a special course in Landegg only a couple of weeks ago, and looking at some of those Baha'is, I realized that I knew their grandparents and their parents and themselves, and now the little children that they had proudly brought with them. And it made me remember what it says in our writings, that the generations follow each other. And somehow even the passing of years took on a new significance as we saw those families and friends who had come up by bus and by private cars from Spain to Switzerland. And this all somehow seems rather relevant to what we're going to think about in these evenings together. It's a very difficult task, as I'm sure everyone can understand, to try to penetrate in some way the depths of the life and the work of the beloved Master. One of the reasons for this is that never in the spiritual history of the world has there been such a figure as Abdu'l Bahá. In the past, and therefore with the greatest difficulty, the followers of the different faiths have tried to relate directly to the manifestation of God. And this, of course, in one way is a wonderful thing, and in another way, because the manifestations of God are a different sort of creation from us, it's not really possible for us to relate to them directly in such a way. But now, for the first time, we have given to the human race an exemplar, a center point of the covenant, someone who is a mystery of God, but at the same time is a human being. And this gives us something that human beings have never had before. This is unique, and this is why I think it's an impossible task to try to relate in depth to such a figure as Abdu'l Bahá. Certainly, I think we cannot relate in depth to the manifestation of God. But nevertheless, we will try in these evenings together to see how close we can come to the wonderful figure of Abdu'l Bahá, remembering always that towering behind the Master, as it were, in whose shadow he walks, we have not only Baha'u'llah, but the beloved Bab also. So I think that there are three great influences on the life of Abdu'l Bahá. Two of them are the manifestations of God. Baha'u'llah, the Abha beauty, and the Bab, the exalted one. And when we come to the will and testament of Abdu'l Bahá, and we try to understand this a little together, then we will see that Abdu'l Bahá really had a relationship with both manifestations of God. And he relates us to them through the will and testament. And then there's another relationship that Abdu'l Bahá had, where the influence was from Baha'u'llah and from the Master himself. But somehow it's a relationship that I cannot separate from Abdu'l Bahá himself. And that's the Master's relationship with his sister, Bahia Khanum, the greatest holy leaf. And the reason I cannot separate those relationships is because after the passing of Abdu'l Bahá, it was the greatest holy leaf who steadied the whole Baha'i world and held it and kept it stable in those years whilst the beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi, readjusted to the tremendous burden that had been placed upon him and the role that destiny had called on Shoghi Effendi to fulfill. And of course, the reason that the beloved guardian was in that situation was because he had been appointed by Abdu'l Bahá to be the guardian of the cause of God. So you see the links, as it were, up and down and right and left and the center. All these links we shall look at from the point of view of Abdu'l Bahá. I mention this now so that perhaps as our story unwinds, we can always keep this in mind. Abdu'l Bahá, as we all know, was born on May 23rd, 1844, which was exactly the night of the declaration of the Bab. When the Master passed away in 1921 in November, what we know as the heroic age came to an end. So this time, the time of the heroes and the martyrs, the time which was the heroic time of the faith, was exactly coinciding with the life of Abdu'l Bahá himself. So we shall need really to start at the very beginning and trace the childhood of Abdu'l Bahá, and then steadily work our way through. Because, as we all know, Baha'u'llah ascended in the year 1892. And of course, by then, Abdu'l Bahá himself was 48 years old. So a very large portion of Abdu'l Bahá's life was lived in the lifetime of his august father. So the first 48 years of Abdu'l Bahá's life are literally living in the, I was going to say radiant shadow, but it's rather difficult to get a radiant shadow, isn't it? But living in the radiance of Baha'u'llah. Bahia Khanum was 2 years younger than Abdu'l Bahá, so as far as Khanum's life was concerned, she had never been without her brother. He was part of her life when she was born. And then Mirza Mihdi, the purest branch, was 4 years younger than Abdu'l Bahá. And that completed the members of the family of Nawab who lived, because one certainly, and maybe two, of Nawab's children didn't live beyond infancy for one reason or another. But before we start looking to Abdu'l Bahá when he was young, I thought it might be interesting to look and see what Professor Brown said about Abdu'l Bahá, because we very often consider what E.G. Brown said about Baha'u'llah, but he said something very interesting about Abdu'l Bahá. And this was in April 1890 that Professor Brown saw Abdu'l Bahá. Of course, it was one of the occasions when he visited Baji to come into the presence of Baha'u'llah. But this is what he says. And please think of your own, perhaps, imagination of Abdu'l Bahá and the photographs we have of the master and so on, and then see what Professor Brown recorded. This is what he saw. Seldom have I seen one whose appearance impressed me more. A tall, strongly built man, holding himself straight as an arrow, with white turban and raiment, long black locks reaching almost to the shoulder, broad, powerful forehead, indicating a strong intellect combined with an unswerving will, eyes keen as a hawk's, and strongly marked but pleasing features. Such was my first impression of Abbas Effendi, the master, Aga, as he par excellence is called by the Babis. Subsequent conversation with him served only to heighten the respect with which his appearance had, from the first, inspired me. One more eloquent of speech, more ready of argument, more apt of illustration, more intimately acquainted with the sacred books of the Jews, the Christians, the Mohammedans, could, I should think, scarcely be found, even amongst the eloquent, ready, and subtle race to which he belongs. These qualities, combined with a bearing at once majestic and genial, made me cease to wonder at the influence and esteem which he enjoyed even beyond the circle of his father's followers. About the greatness of this man and his power, no one who had seen him could entertain a doubt. And then there's Lady Blomfield's description of Abdu'l Bahá when he first came to London, which was in the year 1911. Lady Blomfield wrote, "He arrived, and who shall picture him? A silence as of love and awe overcame us as we looked at him. The gracious figure, clothed in a simple white garment, over which was a light-colored Persian abba. On his head he wore a low-crowned taj, round which was folded a small, fine linen turban of purest white. His hair and short beard were of that snowy whiteness which had once been black. His eyes were large, blue-grey, with long black lashes and well-marked brows. His face was a beautiful oval with warm, ivory-colored skin, a straight, finely modeled nose, and firm, kind mouth. These are merely outside details by which an attempt is made to convey an idea of his arresting personality. Now here is something interesting from Lady Blomfield, which explained something you heard from Professor Brown. His figure was of such perfect symmetry and so full of dignity and grace that the first impression was that of considerable height. He seemed an incarnation of loving understanding, of compassion and power, of wisdom and authority, of strength and a buoyant youthfulness which somehow defied the burden of his years. And such years. One saw, as in a clear vision, that he had so wrought all good and mercy that the inner grace of him had grown greater than all outer sign, and the radiance of this inner glory shone in every glance and word and movement as he came with hands outstretched. So this is the figure and the person of Abdu'l Bahá that perhaps we will keep in mind as we move through now to the time of the Master's childhood. Because although he was named Abbas after his grandfather, Mirza Buzurg, Abdu'l Bahá never saw his grandfather because Mirza Buzurg had died before Abdu'l Bahá was born. We first see the three children as part of a wealthy family of the Persian nobility. And from the vantage point of hindsight, we can look back and we can see their life as the past. But to have some understanding of it, we must try to see it as they experienced it, the ever-moving present of life lived day by day. Those early years would have been spent within the exquisite, delicately balanced and fixed pattern of Persian society of the 19th century. The mainspring of that society was Shia Islam, which had become the state religion of Iran under the Safavid kings in the 16th century. The family had a townhouse in the capital, Tehran, and ancestral property in the country. Now, a typical home of that period was divided into two distinct parts. Now, I'm sure many of the friends who are here know all about this, but we from the West, we knew nothing at all about it until, in fact, we became simply interested because it was the background of the Holy Family. So the house, the home, had these two parts which were quite distinct. There was the Anderun, which housed the women's quarters, to which the ladies of the household were restricted. And it contained their living quarters, the rooms where they entertained their women guests, the kitchens, and it was also the domain of the children and servants. No males, except close relatives and the servants, were allowed there. The men had their own quarters, the Biruni, where they received male visitors, and a door connected these two parts of the house. A high wall around the property gave privacy, but a constant stream of people would pass through its doors, for generous hospitality and charitable assistance were integral parts of Islamic life. Women wore the chador, this long black garment that covered them from head to foot, and no man except a close relative saw the face of a woman. And this led to a custom growing up in Orthodox Muslim families of small girl children, and I mean small, 2, 3 years old, going through a form of marriage which meant nothing at all, it was just a form, with a new male servant or even the family doctor, so that their mother, who was the mistress of the house, could technically regard these men as close relatives, her son-in-law, and thus not have to wear the chador indoors as well as out of the home. I have no idea, and I would think that this probably didn't happen in the family of Baha'u'llah, but it certainly happened in other families. And this shows a little of the restriction of the life of the women in those days, because it's against this background that we must think from time to time of Baha'u'llah's teachings on different aspects of the relationship of men and women and the relationship of those who are living within the family. Now, some light upon the children's grandfather, Mirza Buzurg, who of course was Baha'u'llah's father. He had been minister of state to one of the sons of the king, Fath Ali Shah. And he was so close to the royal family that his last wife, and Mirza Buzurg had quite a retinue of wives, the last one he took was a daughter of the Shah. With the death of Fath Ali Shah in 1834, Muhammad Shah came to the throne. And soon after that, Mirza Buzurg was made governor of a huge area which included the whole of Lorestan. And it was an area which included quite a big part of the territory of some tribes that have since become famous in the West, the Bakhtiari tribes. They live in the southwest of Persia, and it was a disturbed and very rebellious region. Mirza Buzurg governed it well. Before his death in 1839, court intrigue had enmeshed Mirza Buzurg. But his son, Mirza Hussain Ali, whom we know as Baha'u'llah, was held in high esteem. Now, Muhammad Shah died in 1848 and was succeeded by Nasir-i-Din Shah. Now, I have mentioned all this so that we can see the connection of Baha'u'llah's family through the reigns of these different monarchs with the crown of Persia. Now, at the time of the attempt by 3 young Babis to assassinate Nasir-i-Din Shah in 1852, of course after the martyrdom of the Bab in 1850, Baha'u'llah was staying as a guest of the brother of the Shah's Grand Vizier. That's the Prime Minister, I think. So this was the life of the children until the imprisonment of Baha'u'llah in the Sea of Shawal as a result of that attempt on the life of Nasir-i-Din Shah. Because Baha'u'llah himself had accepted the primacy of the mission of the Bab, and he was an ardent and active Babi, especially in the province of Mazandaran and his own district of Nur, where many very notable people became Babis. And we can see now how it was possible for so many eminent men, as well as some very wonderful and eminent ladies in Persia, should accept the Bab, because this was working at what you might call a high level of society, as well as at all the different elements and strata within Persian and Arabic society. But you can see that Baha'u'llah's imprisonment shattered the children's lives. Their lovely home was wrecked and looted by the city mob. With the exception of an Ethiopian black servant, Esfandiar, and Baha'u'llah's loyal brother, Mirza Musa, everyone deserted the family. Relatives, servants, everybody left, and their friends also, because they were afraid that if they associated with Baha'u'llah's family, they would be thought of as Babis as well. Then there was the move from this very beautiful and large house in which they had lived, and the children knew nothing else. This was their life. They moved to a small place in an obscure part of Tehran. There was this daily evidence of the sudden change from immense wealth to great poverty. And it was underlined every day by a crushing anxiety. Was their father still alive or not? They didn't know. One day when he was in Europe, Abdu'l Bahá recalled that time. And the easiest way for us to get a glimpse of it, in fact, is to read what Abdu'l Bahá said. And this is Mr. Baliuz's book, Abdu'l Bahá, As You See. And Abdu'l Bahá, talking about this time, said, "At that time of dire calamities and attacks mounted by the enemies, I was a child of 8. They threw so many stones into our house that the courtyard was crammed with them. Mother took us for safety to another quarter and rented a house in a back alley where she kept us indoors and looked after us. But one day, our means of subsistence was barely adequate, and Mother told me to go to my aunt's house and ask her to find us a few coins. I went, and my aunt did what she could for us. She tied a coin piece in a handkerchief and gave it to me. On my way home, someone recognized me and shouted, 'Here is a Babi!' Whereupon the children in the street chased me. I found refuge in the entrance to a house. There I stayed until nightfall, and when I came out, I was once again pursued by the children, who kept yelling at me and pelted me with stones. When I reached home, I was exhausted. Mother wanted to know what had happened to me. I could not utter a word and collapsed." Abdu'l Bahá was a child of 9. And then one day, because he was so anxious to see his father, Abdu'l Bahá was taken to the dungeon. And this is his account of that awesome visit. "They sent me with a black servant to his blessed presence in the prison. The warders indicated the cell, and the servant carried me in on his shoulders. I saw a dark, steep place. We entered a small, narrow doorway and went down 2 steps, but beyond those one could see nothing. In the middle of the stairway, all of a sudden, we heard his blessed voice. 'Do not bring him in here.' And so they took me back. We sat outside, waiting for the prisoners to be led out. Suddenly, they brought the Blessed Perfection out of the dungeon. He was chained to several others. What a chain! It was very heavy. The prisoners could only move it along with great difficulty. Sad and heartrending it was. Now, those experiences of their childhood no doubt laid the foundation of the special relationship that always existed between Abdu'l Bahá and his sister, Bahia Khanum. Much later, in one of his tablets to his sister, the Master wrote this, and you will find it in the book from the World Center, Bahia Khanum. O my well-beloved, deeply spiritual sister, day and night thou livest in my memory. Whenever I remember thee, my heart swelleth with sadness, and my regret groweth more intense. Grieve not, for I am thy true, thy unfailing comforter. Set thine heart on the tender mercies of the ancient beauty, and be thou filled with abiding joy and intense gladness. And on another occasion, he wrote to the Greatest Holy Leaf when she was away from home, and he said, Write thou a full account of thy condition by every post, for I am most anxious for news of thee. Let me know if thou shouldst desire anyone from here to come to thee, that I may send the person along, even Muniri. Isn't that lovely? Muniri, of course, was the Holy Mother, Abdu'l Bahā's wife, that I may send the person along, even Muniri, so that thou wilt not be homesick. I thought that was such a lovely touch. When at last Nasir-ed-Din Shah agreed to Baha'u'llah's release from the Siyashal, he decreed that he should be banished forever from Iran, and Baha'u'llah was given 1 month in which to leave. He was so ill when he came from the Siyashal, and now he had no home of his own. So he went to his cousin, Mariam, and she and her husband took care of Baha'u'llah, and he was restored somewhat to health by the time he and the family had to leave. 60 years later, Abdu'l Bahá was in Paris, and he brought to mind those days of his childhood. And again we turn to Abdu'l Bahā's words in the book of Mr. Balusi. And Abdu'l Bahá now at the beginning is talking about his delayed stay in Paris. He says, I have been traveling for 2 years and a half. Nowhere was I ill except here. Because of that, I had to stay a long time. Were it not for this illness, I would not have stayed in Paris more than a month. There is a reason for this. It has been so from the early years of my life. The wisdom of whatever has happened to me has become apparent later. While I was a child in Tehran, 7 years of age, I contracted tuberculosis. There was no hope of recovery. Afterwards, the wisdom of and the reason for this became evident. Were it not for that illness, I would have been in Mazandaran. That is the family's country place. But because of it, I remained in Tehran and was there when the Blessed Perfection was imprisoned. Thus I traveled to Iraq in his company. And when the time came, although physicians had despaired of my recovery, I was suddenly cured. It happened in spite of the fact that all had said a cure was impossible. The beloved guardian spoke of Baha'u'llah's experience in the Siyashal, and you remember he became conscious of what his mission would be. The guardian spoke of that experience as the intimation of Baha'u'llah's destiny. The time later in the Rizwan garden in Baghdad, Shoghi Effendi spoke of as Baha'u'llah's declaration. And from Adrianople came Baha'u'llah's proclamation of his mission. But even that was in the future. Immediately now, at this moment, lay a 3-month journey through the winter to Baghdad. They left Tehran on January 12, 1853, and reached Baghdad on the 8th of April. Sometimes you'll find the ages that Abdu'l Bahá mentions are not the same as the ages according to the Gregorian calendar, because sometimes Abdu'l Bahá talked about the lunar calendar. By the calendar of the sun, Abdu'l Bahá was 9 years old then. His younger brother Mirza Mehdi was a small child, and he was left behind in Tehran with his maternal grandmother, because it was felt that he was too young and also too weak in physique to face such a journey. And then, as we all know, the situation gradually became so difficult in Baghdad because of his young half-brother, Mirza Yahya, who very soon was secretly engaged in engineering opposition. And Mirza Yahya, all of his life, was egged on and guided constantly by Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani. That Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani was really a big thorn in the flesh and a bugbear all the way along the line. It had been Baha'u'llah's wish that his younger half-brother should return to Persia, because it was Baha'u'llah, in fact, who himself, from the very early age of Mirza Yahya, had cared for him and had raised him up, because Mirza Yahya was 13 years Baha'u'llah's junior. And we must remember that this was an Oriental family and an Oriental household. And Baha'u'llah was the head of that household at the death of his father. So here we have a younger brother intriguing against his oldest brother. This was not a small thing. It was not even such a thing as it would be regarded here in the Occident. So when Baha'u'llah, to try to hold the situation stable, asked Mirza Yahya to return to Persia and further the cause of the Babi community there, the younger man refused to do so. And deeply grieved by events, Baha'u'llah sought to maintain the unity of the Babi community as it was in Baghdad. After a year of growing discord, the day came when, telling no one of his intentions and taking only an Ethiopian servant with him, Baha'u'llah left for the mountains of Kurdistan. It was April the 10th, 1854. And this was another shock in the lives of Abdu'l Bahá and Bahia Khanum. And it was Abdu'l Bahá who grieved so deeply at his father's absence. But Baha'u'llah wanted to make it plain that he had no aim to assert leadership of the Babi community. Time went by, and then the news was brought to Baghdad of a learned person who had appeared in the mountains of the north, a remarkable person, possessed of unique qualities. And as soon as Abdu'l Bahá heard this, he recognized in this news tidings of his father. And his uncle, Mirza Musa, who was Baha'u'llah's faithful brother, thought the same. And they set about finding an Arab Bahai in nearby Kabul and asked him to make the journey to Kurdistan to see if it were Baha'u'llah and to entreat him to return. This was Sheikh Sultan, and he was accompanied by one person, a woodcutter. I thought always how very nice it was that Javed was always described as Javed the woodcutter. And he accompanied Sheikh Sultan, and he was a Baha'i also of Arab origin. And they found Baha'u'llah. He had been away for 2 years, and his long absence had shown beyond doubt that the community of the Bab had the greatest need of him. Baha'u'llah had intended, so he said, never to return. So deeply did Baha'u'llah always try to establish unity, or to try not to be in any way, any point that could conceivably cause disunity? But the situation was such that Baha'u'llah returned, and he was received back in Baghdad with the utmost joy by his family and those who were close and faithful. But it was only Abdu'l Bahá, who at that time was a boy of 12, who had really understood the full impact of Baha'u'llah's true station. Baha'u'llah found the Babi community in Baghdad completely demoralized and degraded. Sayyid Muhammad, who was much stronger in every way than Mirza Yahya, had really surrounded himself by a band of ruffians, and he allowed them, in fact he encouraged them, to go out at night and snatch the turbans from the heads of wealthy pilgrims who congregated at Karbala, which of course has the shrine of the Imam Hussein. Some of the most dearly respected and revered shrines of Islam, in fact, are in Iraq, not far from Baghdad. And Karbala, of course, with the shrine of the Imam Hussein, is one of them. Well, these people who circled around Sayyid Muhammad and therefore around Mirza Yahya, they stole the shoes of the pilgrims who were praying in the shrine. They robbed the shrine of the Imam Hussein of its divans and candles, and they even took the drinking cups of the public fountains. I think the only way to equate them with something of our time is to really think of the football hooligans who sometimes get let loose, and this was the community of the Bab. No less than 25 of these Babis declared themselves to be the promised one foretold by the Bab. Some because they wanted to make what they could of the situation for themselves, and some because they really wanted to introduce a focal point of some stability. But the Kurds and the Persians, round and about, heaped abuse on them in the streets and expressed their disgust at the cause of the Bab. But with Baha'u'llah's return to Baghdad, he gave the Babis a fixed and accessible center to which they could turn and from which they received steady guidance and inspiration. Slowly but steadily the tide turned. During the next 7 years, it could be said that the Baha'i community was born and slowly took shape under the hand of Baha'u'llah, although he was still known as a Babi and one of the foremost disciples of the Bab. You see, whilst we are talking about Abdu'l Bahá, during this time it's very easy to see that the Master's life was so much bound up with the life of Baha'u'llah. When Baha'u'llah returned to Baghdad, then Abdu'l Bahá began to protect his father from the curious and the insincere, who simply wanted to have a look at this outstanding person. But there also came to the house a stream of visitors who had known Baha'u'llah in Kurdistan, or Babis who came from Persia to come into his presence. And so Persians, Arabs, Turks, Jews, Christians, government officials, princes of the royal blood, humble people, all came to Baha'u'llah's reception room. Then again there was trouble from enemies of the faith and enemies of Baha'u'llah personally. There came repercussions from the court of the Shah in Iran. There was negotiations with the Sultan of Turkey to have Baha'u'llah removed further from the Persian border because they were afraid of his influence, despite the fact that Baha'u'llah insisted that the Babis disassociated themselves from all political activity, from all secret associations and factions. He placed the emphasis on non-violence and strict obedience to authority. He laid stress on godliness, kindliness, chastity, justice, patience, steadfastness, and on the acquisition of arts and sciences. Baha'u'llah really was a great one for getting everybody busy and working. And also, he taught the Babis and his own followers later the importance of resignation to the will of God, which the Muslims in some ways had already forgotten. Eventually, the efforts to remove Baha'u'llah from Baghdad were successful, and he was invited to go to the capital, Constantinople. So 7 years of cleansing, consolidating, and building a new community came to an end. It was on a Wednesday, the 32nd day after Nowruz, that Baha'u'llah left his home in Baghdad for the last time. It was the year 1863, and you will notice if you check the calendars of that time that it wasn't April the 21st, it was April the 22nd. This was because the vernal equinox fell just at that point in that particular year. So if you're seeing God passes by, the first Rizwan goes from the 22nd of April to the 3rd of May. Don't be surprised. I don't think it has happened since then. So the Rizwan period is for us from April the 21st to the 2nd of May. But this was the first Rizwan. And what happened? Baha'u'llah walked to the bank of the river Tigris. He gave generously to the poor and deprived, and consoled and comforted the people who would not see him again. And we have to remember that although some of his companions would go with him on the journey to Constantinople, some would not. And those who were not Babis and never became Babis or Baha'is were inconsolable that Baha'u'llah was taken from them. The thoroughfare to the riverside brimmed with people, men and women, young and old, from all walks of life, who had gathered to see him go, and their loss was felt so deeply that they couldn't be consoled. Baha'u'llah got into the waiting boat and was taken across the river Tigris to the Nabajiya garden, which later became known as the Rizwan garden. Abdu'l Bahá and a younger half-brother, Muhammad Ali, together with the secretary, the amanuensis of Baha'u'llah, Mirza Aghajan, were all with Baha'u'llah in the boat that crossed over that Wednesday afternoon. And as the call to afternoon prayer rang out over the city of Baghdad, they passed into the Nabajiya garden. And as we all know, Baha'u'llah stayed 12 days in that garden. On the 9th day, he was joined by the Holy Family, his wife, and Bahia Khanum also. The servants had stayed the other side of the river to clear up all the things of the house, which was directed and carried out by the servants. On the 9th day, they too crossed the river and lived in the Nabajiya garden. And then on the 12th day of Rizwan, Baha'u'llah left the garden, riding a red roan stallion. And as he left the Rizwan garden, his declaration that he was the promised one foretold by the Bab had already been made, and the whole world passed into a new time. Abdu'l Bahá was 18 years old, nearly 19, and that's where we'll leave him this evening.